Hi everybody, and welcome back for our Task 3.7 video. In today's video, we have one learning target, and that is I can identify function values and interpret them in the context of the problem. Now, we've been using function notation and identifying function values for a while now. What we're going to do is start with a little bit of a review. So, function notation is a way of showing a relationship between the input and the output of a function. One thing that I want you to remember is that the input value is always on the inside of the parentheses. And the output value of a function is always on the outside of the parentheses after the equal sign. So in this problem, what we're going to be asked to do is match up input and output values in tables. Let's start with the first question here. So using this table, we're going to find these values. Finding f of 3 means that since the 3 is on the inside, we are being asked to figure out what's happening when the input, or x, is 3. Find the output. So in the table, I'm going to go ahead and find the row where the input is 3. It looks like it's this one. When I look at that row, I can see that the output is 2. So that would be the corresponding output value. For the second question here, it says find f of 5. Now, since the 5 is on the inside of the parentheses, that's going to be an input value. So I'm going to look for the number 5 in the input column of the table. Looks like it's right here. And then I'm just going to match it up to the output. So when the input is 5, the output is 12. Now let's kind of reverse it. So if the f of x is equal to 6, well, f of x is equal to 6, since the 6 is after the equal sign, that means that this is a y value, or an output value. If I go to my table, I'm going to find the number 6 instead of in the input column. I'm going to be looking for that in the output column. So if I go to the output column, I'm going to look at this row where 6 is the output, corresponds to 4 as the input, or x. Last but not least, if I'm looking for f of x is equal to 20, because the 20 is after the equal sign on the outside of the parentheses, this is going to be a y value, or an output value. So I'm going to find the number 20 in the output column, and that corresponds to the input being 6. Now we can do this exact same thing using a graph instead. So let's take a look at this graph. If I say find g of 3, because 3 is on the inside of the parentheses, that's going to be an input value. So I'm going to look for the number 3 along the x-axis, which is right here. Then I'm going to match that up with the corresponding point. Now that point has an output of 1. So my y value, or my output value here, would be 1. For the next question, it says find g of 5. Since 5 is on the inside of the parentheses, that tells me that that's an input value. So I'm going to look for the number 5 along the x-axis, which means I'm looking right here. Now, there's no point above there, but there is a point below there on the graph, and the corresponding output value would be the number -3. If it says g of x is equal to 5, g of x is equal to 5 because the 5 is on the outside is a y value. It's an output value. So I'm going to start at the 5 on the y-axis and match that up to the point. Now that corresponds to an x coordinate of 1. So 1 would be my answer here. And last but not least, if g of x is equal to -1, then that means that the y value is -1. So I'm going to be looking on the y-axis at the -1. And then if I kind of slide sideways, that gives me this point, which has an x value of 4. So it's the same thing we did in the table, only when we have a graph, instead of looking at the left column or the right column, we start by looking at either the x or the y axis and then matching it up with the other coordinate from its ordered pair. Now let's say I give you an equation. Suppose that we know that h of x is equal to 4x, and I say in problem 1, find h of 3. H of 3 means make the x into a 3. So in this equation, I'm just going to replace the x in the equation with a 3, which means I'm going to have 4 times 3 instead of 4 times x, which means I get 12. So my answer here would just be 12. And if I say find h of 5, that means replace the x with a 5. So instead of 4 times x, I would have 4 times 5, which means I get 20. So my answer here would just be 20. All right, that's a kind of a brief review of how function notation works. Now we're going to focus on the interpreting values in the context of a question. When you're explaining the meaning of a function value, you should always include two pieces of information: the meaning of the x value, including units, as well as the meaning of the y value, including units. So it's going to be really important to make sure you pay attention to the labels on the graph. In this graph, it looks like the labels on the y-axis are gallons of water, and the labels on the x-axis are time in minutes. This problem says Gustavo works at a water park and has to drain the water at the end of each month for the ride he supervises. The graph represents the amount of water in Gustavo's pool, g of x, over time. For problem number 1, it says Gustavo observed that g of 4 is equal to 20,000. What does this mean in the context of the problem? The first thing I want to point out is that we can actually find that point on the graph. So g of 4 is equal to 2,000. We can actually locate that on the graph. When the input is 4, the output is 2,000. You can kind of see that here. 20,000. Now, what we need to do is interpret that in the context of the question. There are two numbers here we need to interpret. The input is 4, that's the x, and the output is 2,000. That's the, 20,000. I keep saying 2,000. That's the y. So we're going to say that when the input, which means the time in minutes, so when the time is 4 minutes, so that's what the 4 means. And now we're going to look at the y coordinate, which is the amount of water in the pool. So the gallons of water is 20,000. So I explained what the input means. The 4 is the number of minutes. And I explained what the output means. The 20,000 is the number of gallons of water. For problem number 2, it says determine the value of g of 8 and then interpret the meaning in the context of the question. Now this problem has two parts to it. First, we need to determine the value of g of 8. So we need to actually find g of 8. Finding g of 8 means when the x is 8, what is the y? So I'm going to find the 8 on the x-axis, and I'm going to match it up to a point on the graph. That point has a y value of 16,000. So I would say 16,000 here. Now, to interpret the meaning, I need to explain what the 8 means as well as what the 16,000 means. So I would say when the time is 8 minutes, because the 8 is the minutes, and then the 16,000 is the number of gallons. So we would say the number of gallons, or the gallons of water, is 16,000. Again, I'm explaining what the x means and I'm explaining what the y means. For number 3, it says if g of x is equal to 4,000, then x is equal to blank, and then interpret the meaning in the context of the question. Well, if g of x is equal to 4,000, what that means is that the y value is 4,000 because the 4,000 is on the outside. So I'm going to find the 4,000 on the y-axis, and I'm going to match that up to a point on the graph, which would be right here. That corresponds to an x value of 20. So the x would have to be 20. Explain the meaning in the context of the question. Again, we need to explain the x and the y. So in this case, the x is 20. So when the time is 20 minutes, the gallons of water, or the number of gallons, is 4,000. Last but not least, we are asked here to write an equation to model the number of gallons in Gustavo's pool. So we need an equation, which means I would suggest making a table of values. So we've got x and we've got y, and we do have a few points we can put in our table. We know that g of 4 is 20,000. We know that g of 8 is 16,000. And we know that g of 20 is 4,000. Now, when I want to write the equation, I'm going to need to start by finding my slope. So that means I'm going to need to figure out the change in y divided by the change in x. The change in y in this problem, I'm going to use the first two numbers here. 20 down to 16 means I subtracted 4,000. So I'm going to have negative 4,000 over the change in x here. I went up by 4. So I would put it over 4. And negative 4,000 divided by 4 would be negative 1,000. Now I can write my equation. So y equals 20,000 is my starting value here. And my slope is minus 1,000, parentheses x. And then I would look over here at my starting x value. And since I want to get back to 0, I would put minus 4. Now, the last thing that I'm going to ask you to do here is if you read the instructions, you can see that it actually says find the equation g of x. So the last thing I'm going to ask you to do here is just change the y to a g of x instead. So g of x is equal to 20,000 minus 1,000 parentheses x minus 4. And there's the equation of our line. Now, on the next page, we're going to do a similar kind of interpreting question, but instead we're going to be talking about Christine's pool. Christine works at the same water park and also has to drain the water at the end of each month for the ride she supervises. However, she doesn't have a graph. She's going to have a table that represents the amount of water in Christine's pool over time. Christine observed that K of 4 is equal to 21,600. What does this mean in the context of the question? Well, again, I think labels are really important here. This is a problem that's telling me that the input values are the time in minutes and the output values are the gallons of water. So when I interpret this, I need to interpret the inputs and the outputs. I'm going to need to talk about the number of minutes as well as the gallons of water. In this problem, since the 4 is on the inside, that's going to be an input. And since the 21,600 is on the outside, that's going to be an output. So we would say that when the time is 4 minutes, the gallons of water is 21,600. Now we can also confirm that by looking at the table. 4 corresponds to 21,600. Determine the value of k of 8. Interpret the meaning in the context of the question. So this problem has two parts to it. First, we need to determine the value of k of 8. So let's do that first. When we want to determine the value of k of 8, that means when the input is 8, what is the output? And I know that because the 8 is on the inside of the parentheses, so that's going to be an input value. In order to figure this out, I'm going to look for the number 8 in the input column of the table, which is right here, and the output would be 16,000. Interpret this in the context of the question means to tell me what does the input mean in this story and what does the output mean. So in this case, I would say when the time, because x is the input, is time, when the time is 8 minutes, and then we're going to be looking at the outputs, which are the number of gallons. We would say the number of gallons is 16,000. Next, it says if k of x is equal to 23,000, then x is equal to, so in this problem, we're going to be looking at k of x is equal to 23,000, which means the output is 23,000. If the output is 23,000, the corresponding input is 3. So we would say then for interpreting, we would say when the time is 3 minutes, the number of gallons or the gallons of water is 23,000. Last but not least, write an equation to model the number of gallons in Christine's pool. Now, unlike our previous problem, we already have a nice table here, so what we're going to need to do is figure out the slope. In order to figure out the slope, we're going to need to do change in y over change in x. The change in y here, I'm going to try to choose some relatively friendly numbers. So let's go from, let's see, 11 to 12. The change in y here would be subtracting 1,400 gallons. Now, you can use a calculator for that if you needed to, subtracting 1,400 gallons. And the change in x here is going to be adding 1. So we're going to have negative 1,400 over 1, which reduces to just negative 1,400. Now we can go ahead and write our equation, which we're supposed to call k of x. So k of x equals our starting value, which is 27,200, minus our slope, so minus 1,400, parentheses x, and then our starting input value here is 0, so we don't need to adjust to get back to 0. We can just put x here. The very last thing we're going to talk about today is comparing these two types of models. So one of the things that you're going to be asked to do is, like, if I give you two different models, a graph and a table, compare them. This problem says, which is greater, g of 12 or k of 12? Explain the meaning of the answer. In order to figure this out, first we need to actually find g of 12 and find k of 12. So to find g of 12, We're going to find the 12 as the input on Gustavo's graph, and then we're going to match that up to the output, which would be 12,000. To find K of 12, we're going to find the 12 as the input in Christine's table. And so we're going to have K of 12 is equal to 10,400. So what does that mean? Well, I'm noticing that the 12 is the same, so the time is the same, but I'm noticing Gustavo's gallons of water is more. So to explain the meaning of our answer, we would say after 12 minutes, because that's the input, there is more water, and I'm going to say more water because that's the output, in Gustavo's pool, because he has more water left over. Last but not least, for what value of x is g of x equal to k of x? Explain the meaning of the answer. So we want to know, for what value of x are the two outputs the same? So we want to find a time when the two outputs here are the same. And we can figure this out by just kind of going down the list and trying to identify when the outputs are the same. So when x is 0, this guy has 24,000, this guy has 27,200. When x is 4, this guy has 20,000, this guy has 21,600. When x is 8, this guy has 16,000, this guy has 16,000. So it looks to me like these two functions have the same value when we've got the point 8, 16,000. There's really no fancy way to do it. You just got to kind of look through the list and see if you can make one of them match. So the first part of the question is, for what value of x is g of x equal to k of x? So we would say when x is equal to 8, g of x is equal to k of x. They're both worth 16,000. What does that mean? Well, if those two have the same 16,000 at 8, then that means after 8 minutes, what does it mean to be equal? The amount of water in the pools is the same. Is the same, or you could say is equal in each pool because they have the same amount, 16,000. All right, thank you guys so much for watching. Have a wonderful afternoon, and I'll see you for some practice.